The history of women's suffrage in the United Kingdom is inextricably linked with the name Emmeline Pankhurst, a figure both revered and controversial. Pankhurst emerged as a central leader in the movement for women's voting rights during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her tireless efforts and radical strategies left an indelible mark on British society and helped pave the way for one of the most significant expansions of democratic rights in modern history. Understanding Pankhurst's role requires not only a study of her actions, but a deeper reflection on the social and political climate in which she operated. Born into a society where women had few legal rights and even fewer political ones, Pankhurst's activism arose out of a profound sense of injustice. Her legacy is more than that of a political agitator. She was a symbol of resilience and strategic brilliance, capable of mobilizing a broad base of support while challenging entrenched systems of power. Her story offers insight into how determined leadership can spark societal change, even in the face of strong resistance. Pankhurst's activism must be understood within the broader historical backdrop of Victorian and Edwardian Britain, where gender norms were rigidly enforced and women's roles were largely confined to domestic spaces. The prevailing ideology of the time promoted the image of women as passive, obedient, and politically disengaged. Against this tide, Pankhurst not only voiced opposition, but took bold and public actions that defied the norms and forced society to confront its own contradictions. Unlike many political leaders of her era, Pankhurst did not emerge from within the halls of Parliament or the elite class. Instead, she rooted her activism in grassroots organizing and collective action. Through the founding of the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, she gave voice to thousands of women who had previously been excluded from the public political sphere. Her belief that deeds, not words, were necessary to achieve change set a confrontational tone that both galvanized supporters and drew harsh criticism. Emmeline Pankhurst's public image was carefully constructed and fiercely maintained. She understood the power of symbolism and media in shaping political discourse. Her speeches were impassioned and direct, designed to stir both emotion and action. Through calculated acts of civil disobedience, she brought unprecedented visibility to the cause of women's suffrage and forced the British public and government alike to reckon with the demands of disenfranchised women. However, Pankhurst was not merely a reactionary figure. She was also a visionary. Her conception of women's rights extended beyond a right to vote. She sought a broader transformation of society in which women would be recognized as equal citizens capable of influencing law, policy, and culture. For her, suffrage was a necessary step toward a larger project of emancipation and self-determination. Her strategies, often controversial, introduced a new form of political engagement that blurred the lines between protest and performance. By using hunger strikes, public demonstrations, and legal confrontations, Pankhurst and her followers transformed the suffrage movement into a national issue that could no longer be ignored. The boldness of their tactics compelled even those who opposed their goals to acknowledge their presence and persistence. The significance of Emmeline Pankhurst's leadership cannot be fully grasped without appreciating her ability to build solidarity among a diverse group of women. Despite social divisions of class and education, she united women through a shared struggle for political recognition. While her movement was not free from internal conflicts or external criticisms, it managed to maintain a strong sense of purpose and urgency throughout her years of leadership. Moreover, Pankhurst's life challenges simplistic narratives of activism. Her political journey included shifts in alliances and priorities, especially during World War I, when she redirected her efforts to support the British war effort. This decision, while controversial, illustrates her pragmatic approach to politics and her capacity to adapt strategies based on changing contexts. It also speaks to the complexities of leading a mass movement over a prolonged period of time. On a chilly summer day, July 15, 1858, in the bustling industrial city of Manchester, Emmeline Golden entered the world. The city, marked by chimneys, factory smoke, and the ceaseless rhythm of machines, was the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution. Yet within its soot-covered streets lay a growing center of reformist thought, a place where radical politics and social activism found fertile ground. Emmeline's birth into such a charged environment foreshadowed the trajectory her life would later take. Her home was not one of silent obedience or rigid propriety, but one where conversation thrived, especially on issues of social justice. The Golden household was intellectually alive. Her father, Robert Golden, was a successful businessman, yet deeply involved in liberal causes. He held strong views on abolitionism and parliamentary reform. Her mother, Sophia, was equally compelling, an ardent supporter of the women's suffrage movement in its nascent form. From a young age, Emmeline was surrounded by voices that questioned the status quo. It was her mother who introduced her to the world of female activism. Sophia would take her to women's rights meetings, sometimes allowing her to sit quietly in the back, where young Emmeline would listen with wide eyes and a budding sense of purpose. These early exposures were not momentary glimpses, but regular, formative experiences. They planted the seeds of resistance in a young girl who otherwise might have been shaped solely by the conventions of Victorian girlhood. Unlike many girls of her time, Emmeline was encouraged to read widely. Books, pamphlets, and political tracts filled the family shelves. Emmeline developed a fondness for the speeches of liberal thinkers and radical reformers. She was especially drawn to the works of Mary Wollstonecraft, whose writing on the rights of women stirred something deep within her. These readings were not merely academic exercises, but windows into the potential for a different world, one where women's voices were not just heard but heeded. Formal education for girls in the 19th century was often limited, but Emmeline's parents were progressive in that regard. At the age of 15, she was sent to École Normale in Paris, a finishing school with a reputation for intellectual rigor, especially for young women. In the salons and lecture rooms of Paris, Emmeline encountered feminist theories that had not yet reached the mainstream in Britain. She learned French fluently, was exposed to European radicalism, and met other young women who challenged traditional roles with confidence and conviction. The experience in France sharpened her awareness of injustice, especially the structural kind that dictated the destinies of women. When she returned to Manchester, she brought with her not only linguistic and cultural knowledge, but also a heightened sense of political consciousness. It was in these years that her youthful curiosity hardened into conviction. The inequality she observed was no longer a vague impression. It was a visible daily affront. At age 20, Emmeline met Richard Pankhurst, a barrister nearly twice her age. He was known in radical circles for his firm support of women's suffrage, and he authored several early legislative proposals aimed at expanding women's rights. Their marriage in 1879 was not just a personal union, but a political alliance. Richard treated Emmeline as an equal partner in his intellectual pursuits, and their home soon became a gathering place for social reformers, activists, and political thinkers. In the private sphere, Emmeline balanced her roles as a mother and wife with her growing political engagement. She bore 5 children and managed a busy household, yet she never allowed domestic life to obscure her sense of social responsibility. The demands of motherhood only deepened her understanding of how policy decisions directly impacted the lives of women and children. She began to view personal experience not as a limitation, but as a legitimate lens through which to engage in public discourse. Her involvement in public service began modestly through local charitable organizations and welfare initiatives. She was particularly disturbed by the poor conditions of workhouses and the treatment of women laborers. These encounters brought her face to face with the human cost of economic inequality. As she moved among Manchester's impoverished neighborhoods, she saw how powerlessness and poverty were most acutely felt by women. Those raising children alone, widowed, or trapped in abusive marriages with no legal recourse. By the end of her early adulthood, Emmeline was no longer simply influenced by political thought. She was shaping it. Her voice began to carry weight in local reform circles. Yet, her sense of urgency grew as she observed how slow and ineffective the existing women's suffrage organizations were. The polite petitions and drawing room discussions, though well-meaning, lacked the force and immediacy she felt the movement required. The stage was set for her evolution from a young activist shaped by family and ideas to a force who would soon reshape the future of British politics. As the final decade of the 19th century dawned, Britain was a nation in transition. Industrial might had reshaped its cities, class tensions were on the rise, and new ideas about democracy were slowly making their way into public discourse. Yet, one fact remained glaringly unchanged. Women, regardless of education or property, remained excluded from the political system. They could not vote in parliamentary elections, nor could they stand as members of parliament. This absence was not merely symbolic. It deprived half the population of representation in decisions affecting every aspect of their lives. Against this backdrop of social change and political stagnation, Emmeline Pankhurst's growing frustration began to take form. She had witnessed firsthand the limitations of existing suffrage efforts, most of which were led by cautious middle-class women who favored gradual reform through petitioning and lobbying sympathetic members of Parliament. While these organizations, like the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, NUWSS, had contributed to raising awareness, their progress was painfully slow. For Emmeline, something more assertive was needed, a movement that demanded, rather than requested, political inclusion. In 1898, the death of her husband Richard, a steadfast supporter of women's rights and her intellectual equal, was a turning point. Though devastated by the loss, Emmeline emerged from mourning with a renewed sense of purpose. His absence also underscored how much of the fight for women's rights still lay ahead, and now she would have to lead it without his counsel. She threw herself into activism with a determination shaped by grief and sharpened by anger at the political inertia she saw around her. In 1903, in her modest home in Manchester, Pankhurst founded what would become the most dynamic and radical women's rights organization in British history, the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU. Unlike other suffrage groups, the WSPU was created with a singular focus, achieving the vote for women, and with an unambiguous motto, deeds, not words. From the beginning, Emmeline made it clear that the WSBU would not be satisfied with slow reforms or polite appeals. It would be a movement of direct action, led by women and for women. The WSBU was unique not only in its methods, but in its structure. Emmeline ensured that leadership remained in female hands, with little tolerance for male interference or compromise. Meetings were tightly organized, and members were expected to be disciplined and courageous. The organization's striking purple, white, and green colors soon became recognizable across the country, stitched into banners, sashes, and armbands as symbols of dignity, purity, and hope. These visual markers helped transform the WSBU into not just a political group, but a cultural force. From the outset, Emmeline's leadership style was bold and charismatic. She did not shrink from confrontation, but sought it, believing that sustained public pressure was essential to break through parliamentary resistance. WSBU members disrupted political meetings, staged demonstrations outside Parliament, and held large-scale rallies in parks and city squares. These actions were designed not only to gain attention, but to shift the national conversation around women's rights. And it worked. Reporters, politicians, and the public began to take notice. The early years of the WSBU were marked by a sense of almost electric energy. Women from various walks of life, teachers, factory workers, actresses, and aristocrats, joined its ranks. What united them was the shared conviction that silence had gone on long enough. Emmeline inspired fierce loyalty in many of her followers, who saw her as both a maternal figure and a commanding general. Her speeches were stirring, crafted not only to motivate, but to awaken a sense of collective purpose among women long denied a political voice. As membership grew, so did opposition. Critics in Parliament denounced the WSBU as disruptive, even dangerous. The press often vilified the group, using terms like hysterical or unfeminine to discredit their actions. But Emmeline understood the power of controversy. She knew that every headline, even a hostile one, served to highlight the cause. In her view, women had been invisible in politics for too long. Visibility, even through scandal, was a necessary first step toward change. What distinguished the WSBU from other movements of the time was its audacity. Under Emmeline's guidance, the group embraced a level of urgency that was previously absent in suffrage circles. No longer content to wait on the goodwill of male legislators, the women of the WSBU began to define their own narrative. They stopped asking for rights and started claiming them, often at personal cost. This spirit of boldness would go on to define the next phase of the movement and Emmeline's evolving legacy. By 1906, the WSBU had outgrown its Manchester roots and moved its headquarters to London, the heart of British political life. From there, the movement would escalate in both visibility and intensity. Emmeline Pankhurst, now a national figure, was no longer just an activist. She had become a symbol of uncompromising defiance, a woman who dared to confront the very foundations of male-dominated power. The movement she founded was only just beginning to show the world how deeply it could shake the system. By the time the Women's Social and Political Union settled in London in 1906, the suffrage movement had undergone a profound transformation. The shift from local activism to national confrontation marked the beginning of a new era, one that would see a dramatic escalation in tactics, visibility, and resistance. At the center of this transformation stood Emmeline Pankhurst, now fully immersed in her role as the movement's leader and public face. London, with its towering institutions and concentrated political power, became the stage for an unprecedented campaign of female defiance. Emmeline Pankhurst approached leadership with an intensity that left little room for hesitation. Every speech, every gathering, and every protest was a carefully orchestrated act of persuasion and provocation. She demanded unwavering commitment from her followers and expected the same discipline and resilience from herself. Under her leadership, the WSBU evolved from a suffrage organization into what many considered a militant political force. For Emmeline, militancy was not a matter of violence, but of visibility. The time for silent suffering had passed. Now, the world had to listen. The new tactics shocked the public. Women chained themselves to railings outside government buildings, disrupted political meetings with shouted slogans, and hurled leaflets from balconies inside the House of Commons. Protesters gathered outside Parliament, demanding to be heard, often resulting in violent clashes with the police. These were not spontaneous outbursts. They were deliberate acts meant to expose the hypocrisy of a democratic government that excluded half its population from representation. Emmeline did not merely approve of such actions. She helped plan them. One of the most iconic early confrontations took place in 1908 when Emmeline led a mass demonstration in Hyde Park that attracted hundreds of thousands of women. The rally, organized with military precision, signaled to the government and the nation that the demand for women's votes was not a fringe issue. It was a political force. Standing on makeshift platforms, flanked by banners and surrounded by determined supporters, Emmeline spoke with fiery resolve, her words echoing through the vast crowd like a drumbeat for justice. As the protests intensified, so too did the state's reaction. Arrests became frequent, and imprisonment a regular consequence for WSBU members. Emmeline herself was arrested multiple times, often charged with incitement or obstruction. Yet imprisonment did not weaken her resolve. On the contrary, she used the courtroom as another platform, turning trials into spectacles of political theater. Her statements in court were passionate indictments of a system that criminalized protest while ignoring oppression. Inside prison, the battle continued. WSBU members, including Emmeline, began hunger strikes as a form of protest against their treatment. Authorities responded with force feeding, a brutal and dehumanizing practice that further exposed the state's harsh tactics against women. The sight of respectable women being dragged, restrained, and fed through tubes sparked outrage and sympathy across British society. Emmeline's suffering in prison, far from silencing her, turned her into a martyr-like figure whose commitment inspired others to join the cause. Despite these hardships, Emmeline never relinquished control of the WSBU. She maintained strict central authority, sometimes to the frustration of other suffragettes who wished for more democratic leadership. Dissent was not tolerated. She believed that unity and focus were essential for victory and feared that internal disagreements would dilute the movement's impact. This approach, while effective in mobilizing actions, would eventually lead to fractures and departures, particularly among those who disagreed with the increasingly militant strategy. Emmeline's leadership also extended to media engagement. She understood the power of headlines and photographs, often ensuring that WSBU activities were covered in the press. The suffragettes adopted a striking visual style, bold typography, coordinated colors, and carefully posed photographs, which made their presence felt in newspapers, postcards, and posters across the country. Emmeline herself became an image, upright, elegant, and defiant. In a society that prized modesty in women, she turned elegance into a form of rebellion. Public opinion was deeply divided. Some hailed the suffragettes as heroines of progress. Others saw them as lawless agitators. Yet even critics could not deny the scale of their impact. Debates about women's suffrage now filled parliamentary sessions and editorial pages. The suffragettes had succeeded in bringing the issue to the very heart of political discourse. Emmeline, with her strategic mind and tireless energy, had transformed a cause into a movement that refused to be ignored. By the end of the decade, Emmeline Pankhurst had become one of the most talked about figures in Britain. Her leadership, forged in defiance and sharpened through struggle, had brought women's suffrage from the margins to the forefront of national consciousness. As Europe teetered on the edge of catastrophe in the summer of 1914, the British suffrage movement found itself at a crossroads. The outbreak of the First World War abruptly halted the escalating conflict between the WSBU and the British government. In a single stroke, priorities across the country shifted from political reform to national survival. The sounds of protest chants and marching suffragettes were drowned out by the clamorous call to arms. And with it came the most profound transformation in Emmeline Pankhurst's political strategy. Far from retreating into silence, Emmeline responded to the war with a dramatic redirection of her energies. She called upon members of the WSBU to suspend their campaign for women's suffrage and support the national war effort. For a woman who had once advocated unyielding resistance against the state, this pivot was startling. But Emmeline saw the war not as a betrayal of her cause, but as an opportunity. By proving women's value to the nation in its darkest hour, she believed they would demonstrate beyond argument their right to citizenship. WSBU activities were swiftly refocused. Headquarters in London, once a hub of political activism, became a center for war work. Women who had once hurled rocks at government buildings now organized recruitment drives, distributed white feathers to shame men into enlisting, and volunteered as nurses, factory workers, and fundraisers. Emmeline threw herself into this effort with the same energy she had once devoted to parliamentary protest. Her speeches took on a different tone, calling for unity, patriotism, and discipline in the face of a common enemy. In the eyes of some former allies, this transformation was nothing short of betrayal. Other suffrage groups, particularly those with pacifist leanings, condemned Emmeline's enthusiastic support of the war. They questioned how a leader who once denounced the government for denying women a voice could now urge unquestioning support of its militaristic aims. But Emmeline remained undeterred. She believed that a successful war effort, powered in large part by the labor and loyalty of women, would build an unassailable case for their enfranchisement. Her personal involvement in the war effort extended beyond rallies and symbolic gestures. Emmeline traveled widely across Britain and even to the United States and Russia, urging support for the Allied cause and championing women's wartime contributions. She visited munitions factories, praised women taking on roles traditionally reserved for men, and insisted that such service should be met with political reward. Her tone was one of proud assertiveness, often declaring that women had become the backbone of the nation. The war years also altered the composition of women's labor. With millions of men conscripted into military service, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They drove trams, worked as blacksmiths, and filled positions in government offices. Emmeline pointed to these developments as proof that the old arguments against women's suffrage, claims of intellectual inferiority or domestic confinement, had been irrevocably disproven. A woman who could build a bomb or manage a farm could certainly cast a ballot. Though she distanced the WSBU from its former militant tactics, Emmeline did not dissolve its organizational power. Instead, she repurposed it to serve the war. The WSBU's newspaper, Britannia, replaced the suffragette and began publishing articles that blended patriotism with advocacy for women's rights. In its pages, readers found stories of female heroism on the home front, as well as subtle but persistent reminders that loyalty deserved recognition, not only in medals and wages, but in voting rights. Behind the fervor, however, there was strain. Emmeline's leadership style remained unyielding, and her decision to prioritize the war effort alienated many within the suffrage movement, including her own daughters. Christabel remained loyal to her mother's vision, but Sylvia and Adela broke away, disillusioned by Emmeline's alliance with the state and her abandonment of pacifist ideals. These personal and political rifts were painful, but Emmeline stood firm. believing her path was the only realistic course. By the time the war drew to a close in 1918, Britain was a changed nation. The once radical idea of women as essential participants in national life had been realized not through protest, but through necessity. Emmeline's strategic shift had paid off. That same year, the Representation of the People Act was passed, granting voting rights to women over the age of 30 who met minimum property qualifications. It was not complete suffrage, but it was a monumental step, and one that would not have come so swiftly without women's visible wartime service. As the armistice was signed and soldiers returned home, Emmeline Pankhurst stood at the threshold of a new era. Her movement had sacrificed militancy for legitimacy, protest for patriotism. In doing so, it had helped shift public and political perception of women's roles in society. With the suffrage movement transformed by the demands of war, Emmeline Pankhurst found herself navigating not only the shifting terrain of national politics, but also the deepening fractures within her own family and ideological circle. The fierce unity that once defined the WSBU had given way to an increasingly fragmented legacy. While Emmeline remained steadfast in her approach, the toll of years of leadership, conflict, and adaptation had begun to reveal itself in more personal ways. One of the most painful outcomes of this ideological divergence was the estrangement between Emmeline and her daughters, particularly Sylvia and Adela. Both had grown up under the influence of their mother's political passion, but each ultimately chose a path that diverged from Emmeline's increasingly nationalist and authoritarian stance. Sylvia, committed to socialism and pacifism, criticized the WSBU's abandonment of working-class causes and its alliance with establishment politics during the war. She eventually founded her own organization in East London, where she worked alongside trade unionists and labor activists. The conflict between mother and daughter grew not only from political differences, but from deep emotional wounds. Emmeline, once the central pillar of her family, had become distant and often uncompromising in her relationships. Letters between her and Sylvia became cold and formal, marked by disagreement rather than affection. Adela, too, fell out of favor when she adopted a more radical, internationalist view, eventually emigrating to Australia, where she would engage in political activism far removed from her mother's increasingly conservative ideals. Despite these personal ruptures, Emmeline pressed on, cloaking private grief in public determination. Her relationship with Christabel, her eldest daughter, remained intact, though even that bond was shaped more by shared strategy than familial warmth. Christabel had taken on many of the responsibilities of leadership during the war years, and their collaboration became more professional than maternal. Their joint efforts projected unity to the public, even as the family splintered behind closed doors. Outside the family, ideological divisions also widened. Former allies in the suffrage movement began to express discomfort with Emmeline's authoritarian methods. Her insistence on top-down control within the WSBU had, in many cases, alienated talented organizers who wanted more inclusive leadership. Women who had marched, spoken, and suffered imprisonment under the WSBU banner now found themselves marginalized when they voiced dissent. Emmeline, always suspicious of disunity, viewed internal critique as sabotage rather than dialogue. Compounding this isolation was Emmeline's gradual movement toward the political right. Her wartime rhetoric, once justified as a temporary necessity, began to bleed into her post-war vision. She expressed concerns about the rise of socialism, feared labor unrest, and spoke with increasing admiration for conservative ideals of order, discipline, and national pride. This shift was unsettling to those who remembered her as a radical reformer. and some accused her of betraying the very foundation of her early activism. Emotionally, Emmeline became more guarded. Decades of public scrutiny, legal battles, and personal disappointment had weathered her once fiery spirit. Though she remained eloquent and commanding, there was a hardness to her that had not been present in her younger years. She no longer saw compromise as a viable strategy. For her, conviction had to be absolute. Yet in moments of quiet reflection, those close to her reported glimpses of sorrow, losses not only of family, but of an earlier vision of the movement she had once led with such idealism. Her personal life offered little solace. Emmeline, now in her late 50s and worn by years of tireless activism, lived a more solitary existence. The grandeur of WSBU rallies and international tours have been replaced by speaking engagements and political meetings that often left her physically exhausted. Though still surrounded by admirers, she rarely opened herself to intimacy or vulnerability. The fight had defined her life, but had also consumed many of her closest relationships. These years also marked the beginning of her efforts to re-establish herself within the political mainstream. No longer an outsider throwing stones at Parliament, Emmeline now entertained ambitions of entering the halls of power herself. She began aligning more closely with the Conservative Party, believing that women's suffrage could be preserved and expanded through traditional institutions rather than radical upheaval. It was a remarkable transformation for someone who had once disrupted those very institutions with defiant protest. In this period of redefinition, Emmeline Pankhurst stood both as a towering symbol and a solitary figure. She had helped shake the foundations of British society, but at the cost of profound personal and ideological sacrifices. As the dust of war settled and Britain emerged into a new political era, Emmeline Pankhurst found herself increasingly drawn to the international stage. While her focus had once been tightly fixed on Westminster and Whitehall, she now saw the broader potential for her life's work to resonate far beyond British shores. The struggle for women's rights, after all, was not limited to a single nation. It was a global cause, unfolding across continents, from the bustling cities of North America to the emerging democracies of Europe and the colonial frontiers of the British Empire. Her international reputation had been building for years, fueled by press coverage of WSBU protests and her own carefully curated image. But it was during and after World War I that her name carried the weight of both legacy and leadership. She was invited to speak in the United States, where audiences filled lecture halls to hear her recount the suffragette movement's battles and its unexpected transformation during wartime. These tours were as much political as personal, enabling her to shape how the world remembered the British suffrage struggle and her own role within it. In America, Emmeline's reception was complex. She was admired for her courage and unrelenting determination, but some activists, especially those in the progressive and socialist movements, were wary of her increasing conservatism. While American suffragists like Alice Paul had adopted militant tactics inspired by the WSBU, others in the National American Woman Suffrage Association preferred more moderate approaches. Emmeline, however, remained unapologetic. Her message emphasized discipline, duty, and loyalty to the state, values that clashed with the more expansive social agendas of her hosts. Despite ideological tensions, her presence made an impression. Newspapers across the United States described her as the general of women's emancipation, while universities and women's clubs invited her to speak to young audiences eager to understand the path to political change. In these talks, Emmeline emphasized not only the vote, but also the responsibility that came with it. Her speeches often concluded with calls for women to serve their countries with the same dedication they had shown in winning the franchise. Her growing international stature also brought her to the attention of newly emerging nations and colonies striving to define their identities. In the post-war years, as former colonies agitated for self-governance, women in those regions began organizing for suffrage, inspired in part by what had occurred in Britain. Emmeline's writings were translated and circulated in Canada, New Zealand, India, and South Africa, sparking debate and motivation among women who sought political voice within vastly different cultural contexts. She was particularly intrigued by the developments in the British Dominions, where women had already begun securing voting rights independently. New Zealand had granted women the vote in 1893, and Australia followed in 1902. These precedents gave Emmeline a comparative lens through which to reflect on Britain's delayed progress and fueled her growing interest in global governance. She often pointed to these countries as evidence that female enfranchisement was not only possible, but beneficial to democratic societies. As her international profile expanded, Emmeline became something of a symbol. No longer just a campaigner, but a figure of historical significance. Feminists, scholars, and journalists around the world sought interviews and statements from her, hoping to capture insights from one of the most recognizable faces of the movement. She was no longer leading marches or facing arrest, but her voice retained authority. Her words were quoted in parliaments, political journals, and emerging feminist periodicals in multiple languages. Her engagement abroad did not lessen her commitment to national issues, but it did offer her a broader perspective. She began advocating for what she termed imperial womanhood, a concept blending support for British unity and strength with the idea that women across the empire could become agents of civilization and order. This vision, while praised by some as a bold expansion of women's influence, was critiqued by others for overlooking the complex dynamics of colonialism and indigenous resistance. In later speeches and writings, Emmeline made efforts to frame the global fight for women's rights as part of a larger moral mission. She argued that enfranchised women would bring ethical balance to governance, tempering aggression with compassion and corruption with accountability. Her rhetoric became more universal, appealing to shared values rather than partisan loyalties. By the early 1920s, she was no longer just a British icon. She was viewed as a matriarch of the international suffrage movement. Though she never occupied a seat in a transnational organization, Emmeline Pankhurst's impact on global feminism was indisputable. Her campaigns had created a blueprint, however contentious, for political disruption and female mobilization. As the 1920s progressed, Emmeline Pankhurst entered the twilight of her life with a shifting sense of purpose. No longer organizing marches or facing down hostile crowds, she found herself navigating the quieter, though no less complex, corridors of political legitimacy. With women now partially enfranchised in Britain, Emmeline's focus turned toward what she saw as the next logical step, entering the formal political sphere herself. It was a transition from agitator to stateswoman, one that brought both opportunity and contradiction. In 1926, Emmeline joined the Conservative Party, a surprising move to many who had followed her earlier radicalism. But for Emmeline, it was a natural evolution. She had come to believe that women's continued advancement depended not on revolution, but on working within established institutions. The conservatism she embraced was one of order, tradition, and gradual reform, an ideology that contrasted sharply with the rebellious fervor of her WSBU days, but aligned with her desire to secure stability after decades of turmoil. She quickly became a prominent figure within the party's women's division, using her experience and fame to advocate for policies that supported women's welfare, education, and employment rights. Emmeline saw political office not merely as a reward for past activism, but as a platform for shaping the country's future. Her speeches at party gatherings were well attended, often attracting more attention than those of her male counterparts. Always the orator, she delivered addresses with precision and gravity, unburdened by the militancy that had once defined her public image. Her decision to stand for Parliament was both symbolic and practical. In 1927, she was selected as the Conservative candidate for the Whitechapel and St. George's Division in East London, a district that had once been the base of her daughter Sylvia's socialist campaigning. The choice of constituency was steeped in irony and emotion, but Emmeline appeared undeterred. She saw it as a chance to serve the very communities where her political convictions had first been tested. Despite her advancing age and declining health, she threw herself into the campaign with characteristic resolve. She visited local organizations, spoke to working-class women, and emphasized the need for maternal health services, housing reform, and support for families of returning soldiers. Unlike her earlier rhetoric, which had focused heavily on women's exclusion, her campaign as a candidate was forward-looking, centered on building a society where women's contributions would be fully integrated and valued. Privately, however, her strength was beginning to fade. Years of relentless activism, travel, and emotional strain had taken their toll. She suffered from recurring bouts of illness and fatigue that increasingly interfered with her public appearances. Friends and colleagues noted that she often seemed worn, sometimes forgetting names or drifting into periods of reflective silence. The physical signs of aging, once masked by the force of her personality, were becoming more visible. Still, she pressed on, determined not to let fragility undermine her sense of duty. Her speeches became shorter but more poignant, filled with the authority of lived experience. She spoke less of protest and more of progress, always with an eye on what still remained to be achieved. Though her body was weakening, her will remained unbroken. She saw herself not as a relic of a past era, but as a living bridge between what had been fought for and what still lay ahead. In these final years, she was also more contemplative. Observers noticed a quietening in her manner, a gentleness that had long been buried under the intensity of public struggle. She began to speak openly about the cost of leadership, the friendships lost, the family tensions, the moments of loneliness that activism often demands. Yet there was no bitterness in her reflections, only a kind of solemn pride that she had played her part, however imperfectly, in a movement larger than herself. Her campaign was cut short before she could see it through. In June 1928, just weeks before the election, Emmeline Pankhurst passed away in London. Her death came just days before the full enfranchisement of women was finally granted through the Representation of the People, Equal Franchise Act, which gave voting rights to all women over the age of 21, regardless of property ownership. It was a final, poetic coincidence. The woman who had dedicated her life to the cause would not live to cast a vote under the very terms she had so long demanded. Emmeline's funeral was a solemn and dignified affair, attended by friends, former adversaries, political leaders, and hundreds of women who had marched beside her. Her coffin was draped with the purple, white, and green of the suffragette flag, and her eulogy spoke of courage, transformation, and the power of conviction. In the years following Emmeline Pankhurst's death, the meaning and magnitude of her legacy became a subject of ongoing discussion. As with many historical figures who defied convention and redefined boundaries, she left behind a trail that was both celebrated and contested. Some hailed her as the quintessential symbol of feminist struggle, fearless, strategic, and transformative, while others questioned the rigidity of her methods and the compromises she made later in life. The conversation about Emmeline's place in history was not merely one of remembrance, but of interpretation. Her image began to evolve almost immediately. Early biographies, written by those close to her or inspired by her, cast her in near-mythic terms. These accounts emphasized her leadership, her charisma, and her courage under pressure. They spoke of a woman who had withstood ridicule, imprisonment, and hunger strikes, all to advance the cause of gender equality. For many young feminists in the 1930s and 1940s, she became a symbol of what was possible when determination intersected with historical necessity. Yet not all perspectives were laudatory. Some contemporaries and later historians critiqued the authoritarian structure of the women's social and political union, highlighting how dissent was often silenced within its ranks. Others focused on her shift toward conservatism, questioning whether her later affiliations diluted the radicalism of her earlier years. These critics argued that in narrowing the suffrage movement's goals and alienating class-conscious allies, Emmeline may have hindered a more inclusive form of social reform. Over time, this tension between admiration and critique deepened. During the second wave of feminism in the 1960s and 70s, activists revisited Emmeline's life with fresh eyes. Some found inspiration in her audacity and public defiance, particularly in a world that still largely discouraged women from political confrontation. Others, however, preferred to highlight figures like Sylvia Pankhurst or Millicent Fawcett, whose approaches better aligned with evolving feminist ideals of intersectionality and inclusiveness. Despite differing assessments, one thing remained uncontested. Emmeline Pankhurst had permanently altered the trajectory of British politics. Her legacy was physically embedded in the nation's consciousness, most notably through statues, plaques, and institutional commemorations. In 1930, a prominent statue was erected in London's Victoria Tower Gardens, just a short walk from the Houses of Parliament, an enduring testament to her role in expanding the electorate. The statue itself became a site of pilgrimage and protest, with successive generations of women's rights activists gathering there to honor or debate her legacy. Over the decades, flowers were laid, speeches delivered, and banners unfurled at its base. Emmeline's name became shorthand for a type of fearless, often polarizing activism. Whether invoked with reverence or reservation, it retained a symbolic power that extended far beyond her own lifetime. Her impact was also felt in educational and cultural spheres. British school curricula began to include lessons about the suffragettes, often with Emmeline at the center. Documentaries, plays, and novels dramatized her life, introducing new audiences to the complexities of her mission. Filmmakers portrayed her as both a rebel and a strategist, while playwrights examined the emotional toll of her activism. Each retelling emphasized different facets, but all acknowledged her profound historical significance. Internationally, Emmeline's legacy took on a global dimension. Feminist scholars across Europe, North America, and post-colonial nations studied her methods and their relevance to local movements. In some countries, her example inspired similar tactics, marches, hunger strikes, and symbolic defiance, while in others, her top-down leadership style sparked debate about inclusivity in social justice campaigns. The global feminist movement wrestled with the contradictions of her legacy, much as her British successors had done. As the 21st century advanced, Emmeline's image was increasingly reframed to fit contemporary dialogues on gender, politics, and power. In a world more aware of intersectionality, her focus on white, middle, and upper-class women drew scrutiny, prompting calls to recontextualize her achievements within broader systems of privilege. Yet these critiques coexisted with continued celebration. In 2018, marking the centenary of the first women's votes in Britain, her legacy was again spotlighted, reaffirming her central role in that historic milestone. In the century since Emmeline Pankhurst first rose to prominence, feminism has undergone numerous transformations, expanding far beyond the vote into struggles for reproductive rights, workplace equality, sexual freedom, and bodily autonomy. As waves of feminism surged and receded, Emmeline's name remained anchored in its early tides, still powerful, still provoking admiration and scrutiny. Her image, once feared and revered on the front pages of Edwardian newspapers, became a symbol studied in textbooks, immortalized in stone, and invoked on placards carried through modern-day marches. In the 21st century, reflections on Emmeline's life have grown more nuanced, infused with the language of intersectionality and informed by a more global awareness of oppression. Scholars and activists increasingly analyze her achievements not in isolation, but as part of a larger tapestry, one woven with threads of race, class, empire, and gender. This has led to a more critical evaluation of her methods and motives, especially regarding whom her activism included and whom it left behind. Yet such critique is not dismissal. Rather, it affirms the depth and complexity of her legacy, which continues to spark debate in both academic and activist circles. Modern feminists encounter Emmeline Pankhurst at a crossroads of continuity and contrast. On one hand, her story exemplifies what determined, strategic protest can achieve, especially in the face of institutional resistance. Her willingness to disrupt, to challenge, and to endure consequences for the sake of principle resonates with those who continue to confront injustice today. On the other hand, her narrative invites reflection on the evolution of feminist goals, from singular rights like suffrage to broader ideals of equity, dignity, and recognition for all, regardless of identity or background. The symbolic power of Emmeline Pankhurst has grown with time, taking on different shapes in different contexts. In public commemorations, she stands tall as a figure of progress. In feminist thought, she is dissected as a case study in leadership, strategy, and ideological tension. In political history, she is remembered as a disruptor who forced the machinery of state to reckon with female demands. In culture, she has become an archetype of the radical woman, bold, articulate, and uncompromising in pursuit of justice. Her enduring relevance lies not only in what she did, but in how she forced societies to reckon with women as political agents. Before Emmeline and her contemporaries, women were largely invisible in the public sphere. They were spoken for, not spoken to. Through her oratory, her defiance, and her sheer persistence, she demanded not only rights, but attention. Her life declared that women would no longer accept silence as the price of civility. Today, when women rise and protest around the globe against gender-based violence, for pay equity, for reproductive freedom, they often echo, consciously or not, the spirit of resistance that Emmeline embodied. Whether in massive demonstrations or intimate community organizing, the DNA of her confrontational courage can be traced in their methods. Her legacy is thus not static. It is regenerative, reappearing in new movements adapted to new challenges. Yet it is in the complexity of her legacy that her humanity is most visible. She was not perfect, nor did she claim to be. She made choices that alienated allies, pursued goals that some considered narrow, and shifted political alliances in ways that perplexed even her followers. But in this, she mirrored the contradictions of her time, and perhaps of all transformative leaders. Her strength was not in her consistency, but in her conviction. As future generations grapple with old and emerging inequalities, Emmeline's story offers more than a historical lesson. It provides a framework for understanding how societal change is contested, negotiated, and at times won at great cost. She reminds us that progress is rarely linear and that the path to justice is often paved with difficult decisions, moral ambiguity, and relentless effort. Her life invites each new generation to ask essential questions. Were we willing to sacrifice for change? Who speaks for whom in a movement? How do we ensure that the margins are not forgotten in the pursuit of major victories? Emmeline's legacy does not answer these questions. It demands that they be asked. In the final measure, Emmeline Pankhurst's relevance endures not because she was flawless, but because she was fierce in her refusal to accept the world as it was. Her story remains a rallying point, a cautionary tale, and an invitation to action, all at once. In remembering her, we do not simply honor the past. We continue a conversation that she began, one that still shapes the future.